In the grim, bloody theater of the American Old West, where the stage was set by legend and the curtain fell on sudden death, certain names achieved a terrifying immortality. Yet, for every figure bathed in the harsh spotlight of lasting fame, for every kid, every Earp, there existed a companion who walked perpetually in the shadow, a soul whose tragedy was compounded by obscurity. This is the specter of Charlie Bowdre, an outlaw whose fate was so unrelentingly cruel, so marked by a relentless series of unfortunate decisions, that history has in its bitter irony afforded him the title of the Old West's most unlucky outlaw. Bowdre's existence itself was a stark contradiction. A man born in 1848 to a respectable family in Wilkes County, Georgia, and later transplanted to the Mississippi frontier, destined to become a cowboy and an associate of the most infamous juvenile delinquent the territory had ever known. He was not a leader, but a steadfast companion, a man whose defining quality was his loyalty to the chaotic, magnetic figure of Billy the Kid. Our narrative ambition here is not merely to recount the events of his short, doomed life, but to plumb the depths of his tragic arc, to understand the personal perspective of a man caught in a tidal wave of historical violence, who desperately and futilely sought a way out. This is a journey into a time when friendship was sealed with gunpowder, and a man's luck could run out not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing siege. Prepare to witness the intersection of unwavering loyalty and catastrophic misfortune as we unravel the story of Charlie Bowdre, the man forever bound to a fate he could never outrun. The journey of Charlie Bowdre into the abyss of outlawry was not a graceful descent, but a series of violent, ill-conceived plunges, establishing a pattern of poor judgment that would define his life. Even before the full conflagration of the Lincoln County War consumed the territory, Bowdre demonstrated a peculiar, brutal sense of justice untethered from any lawful authority. In a move that perfectly encapsulated the chaotic moral code of the New Mexico frontier, Bowdre, in concert with his associate A.B. Saunders, staged a daring, high-stakes attack on the poorly defended Lincoln prison. Their objective, to liberate a cattle thief named Jesus Largo from the custody of Sheriff Saturnino Baca. The raid was successful, a bold affront to the territorial law, showcasing Bowdre's courage and willingness to engage in direct conflict. Yet, the outcome of this heroic act was immediately undercut by a staggering betrayal of the very concept of liberation. Having risked their lives to free Largo, Bowdre and his comrades, without receiving any expected remuneration or profit for their daring deeds, simply escorted Largo out of town and summarily hanged him. This cold, immediate execution of the man they had just freed serves as a chilling preamble to Bowdre's subsequent career, revealing a man capable of impulsive loyalty and sudden, fatal cruelty, a complex, dangerous mix. This early lethal episode was soon followed by a far more ignominious run-in with the law, demonstrating Bowdre's lack of discipline when divorced from the structure of a crew. On August 5, 1877, Bowdre found himself squarely in legal trouble when he and an unnamed associate were arrested for the mundane, yet life-threatening, frontier offense of shooting while intoxicated at down of Lincoln. These initial legal skirmishes, one showing calculated, deadly vigilante action, the other showing reckless, drunken endangerment, established Bowdre as a known entity in the small, charged settlement, marking him for future roles in the region's simmering conflicts. The entire territory erupted in violence with the outbreak of the Lincoln County War in 1878, and Charlie Bowdre, already possessing a reputation for volatility and a record of confrontation with the law, could not remain neutral. He quickly and decisively aligned himself with the Tunstall-McSween faction, the side representing the interests of the newly arrived English rancher and merchant Alexander McSween, who stood in opposition to the powerful, corrupt house run by James Dolan and Lawrence Murphy. This political and economic conflict was the forge in which the most famous and infamous outlaws of the era were hammered into shape. It was during this turbulent time that Bowdre's destiny became inextricably linked with the iconic youth of the West. He not only met Billy the Kid, solidifying the close association that would define his historical memory. But he also fell in with a cohort of men whose names would soon become synonymous with frontier violence, collectively forming the nucleus of the faction's armed enforcement arm known as the Regulators. His key associations included men like José Chavez, the enigmatic and deadly Hispano gunman; Richard M. Brewer, the tough first leader of the group; Jim French; and the rancher brothers George Coe and Frank Coe. Bowdre was not merely a peripheral ally. He became an active, committed member of this core group, trading his life as a simple cowboy for the perilous, elevated status of an armed regulator. His skill with a gun now dedicated to the political and commercial interests of the McSween faction, and his fate bound tightly to the charisma and chaos of Billy the Kid. The escalation of the Lincoln County War swiftly pulled Charlie Bowdre from the edges of minor outlawry into the center of organized, large-scale killing. As a newly minted member of the Regulators, Bowdre's lethal commitment to the Tunstall-McSween faction was immediately tested. The first major confrontation that etched his name into the war as bloody ledger occurred at Blackwater Creek on March 9, 1878. Following the murder of their employer and mentor, John Tunstall, the Regulators were seeking vengeance, or, at the very least, justice on their own terms. Bowdre was present during the fatal encounter that saw the demise of 3 men associated with the rival House faction, and the official law, William Morton, Frank Baker, and William McCloskey. The circumstances of the triple killing remain contentious, but the outcome was brutally final. Morton and Baker, both accused of involvement in Tunstall's murder, were allegedly captured and promised safe passage to Lincoln, only to be executed en route. McCloskey, a Regulator's comrade, was also killed, though whether by the hand of the Housemen or by his own comrades, who may have suspected him of treachery, remains one of the enduring, dark uncertainties of the conflict. Regardless of the internal motives, Bowdre's participation in this notorious extrajudicial killing spree irrevocably marked him as a committed killer in the eyes of the law and his enemies, solidifying his identity as one of Billy the Kid's dangerous inner circle. The narrative of Bowdre's misfortune reached a dramatic, bloody climax less than a month later at the gunfight at Blazer's Mill on April 4, 1878. The Regulators were pursuing a former buffalo hunter named Andrew Buckshot Roberts, who had evaded their attempts to bring him in for involvement in Tunstall's killing. Roberts, a man known for his tenacious courage, was cornered at Blazer's Mill. What ensued was a chaotic, desperate exchange of gunfire that proved to be a pivotal, devastating moment for the Regulators. In the fierce volley of shots, the Regulators' first leader, Dick Brewer, was killed. But it was in the thick of the fighting that Bowdre encountered his own moment of extreme peril. He was struck by a bullet from Roberts' gun. The blow was serious, debilitating, and threatened to end Bowdre's life on the spot. Yet, in a terrifying display of sheer frontier willpower, the wounded Bowdre refused to die passively. Driven by pain, revenge, and the survival instinct that defines the desperate, he rallied his remaining strength. In a final, desperate act of vengeance that secured his own survival in the short term, Bowdre managed to line up his shot and fire a round that struck Roberts, killing him dead. It was a gruesome, tit-for-tat exchange of lethal force that left 2 men dead and Bowdre severely wounded, cementing the chaotic reputation of the Regulators. For this singular documented act of vengeance, the death of Buckshot Roberts Bowdre was formally charged with murder. The encounter, while a victory of survival, placed the unluckiest outlaw under the permanent, heavy cloud of a capital crime. The climax of the war arrived with the brutal 5-day siege known as the Battle of Lincoln, which raged from July 15th to July 1978. This was the definitive, sprawling confrontation between the McSween and Murphy-Dolan factions, a desperate final struggle that saw the burning of the McSween house and the death of Alexander McSween himself. Bowdre, despite the crippling legal warrant hanging over his head and the lingering memory of his near-fatal wound from Blazer's Mill, remained fiercely loyal to the cause. He actively participated in the battle, fighting alongside Billy the Kid and the remaining regulators throughout the intense siege. Though the battle ended in a tactical defeat for the McSween faction, with many of the regulators either killed, captured, or scattered, Bowdre's willingness to commit his life and gun to the conflict cemented his legacy as a devoted partisan and a veteran of the war, as most defining deadly engagements. Having survived the war, however, Bowdre found himself trapped, an outlaw with a murder warrant for Buckshot Roberts' death, perpetually on the run, with a dwindling number of comrades bound by fate to the dangerous path chosen by his closest friend Billy the Kid. Hearken, and let the wind carry the mournful, magnificent, and terribly brief chronicle of Charles Meriwether Bowdre, a man whose life, like a tragic ballad sung beneath a high desert moon, was forever cursed by an almost redemption, earning him the grim epitaph, the Old West's most unlucky outlaw. This is not merely a recounting of deeds, but an excavation into the heart of a soul caught between the magnetic pull of chaos and the desperate, fragile lure of domestic tranquility. Born in the relative civility of Georgia, a world away from the blood-soaked sands of New Mexico, Bowdre journeyed west seeking, one must assume, the quintessential American dream, a fresh start, a stake in the limitless horizon. He arrived in the territory not as a hardened criminal, but as a ranch hand, a cowboy of genuine skill, and for a glorious fleeting period, his hands were calloused by honest work, not the cold steel of a Colt revolver. The promise of stability beckoned him, a siren song against the cacophony of the escalating Lincoln County War. Bowdre found legitimate employment, writing the vast, unforgiving spreads for men like Thomas Yerby and Pete Maxwell, the latter a name inextricably linked to his final undoing. This was the life Charlie Bowdre truly wanted, the scent of sun-drenched leather, the lowing of cattle, and the predictable rhythm of the seasons, a stark contrast to the volatile, day-to-day existence of a regulator or a thief. It was a calculated, if desperate, move towards a legal, grounded life, a conscious effort to shed the mantle of the gunfighter earned in the bloody wake of the war. He dipped his boots into mercantile endeavors, seeking the respectability and permanence that came with a settled trade. The West was in flux, and men were building empires. Charlie Bowdre wanted only to build a modest home. The deepest anchor he cast into the harbor of legitimacy was his marriage to Manuela Herrera. The sheer symbolism of this union cannot be overstated, for it was the ultimate, eloquent rejection of the outlaw trail. He married into a settled family, his wife being the sister of Antonia Herrera, who was herself married to the respected, though conflicted, Doc Skurlock, a man who himself had already stepped away from the abyss of Billy the Kid's orbit. This wasn't merely a wedding. It was a commitment to a future defined by a woman's love and the quiet demands of a home, a life where the shadow of the gallows would ideally never fall. The marriage itself suggests a profound shift in Charlie's internal compass, a yearning for the peace that only a legitimate life, a shared hearth, and a devoted wife could offer. Yet Bowdre's tale is a masterclass in cosmic irony. The past in the ruthless world of the Old West was never truly past, and friendship, in the end, proved to be a loyalty stronger than the bonds of matrimony or the yearning for peace. The tragedy of Charlie Bowdre lies in his fatal inability to sever the last, thinnest threads connecting him to the outlaw fraternity, specifically to the kinetic, deadly charisma of Billy the Kid. He attempted to negotiate surrender terms for the murder of Buckshot Roberts, an action that screams of his desire for a clean slate, a legal resolution that would allow him to return to Manuela, a free man if a diminished one. But the deals failed, the past remained an open wound, and Bowdre, adrift in a moral vacuum, allowed himself to be pulled back, convinced to join the gang on one final, ill-fated mission to ambush Pat Garrett. The culminating moment of his terrible luck arrived on December 23, 1880, at the desolate windswept rock house of Stinking Springs. It was a morning born of desperation, the gang surrounded by Garrett's posse, pinned like rats in a trap. The fatal choice was driven not by the instinct of a gunfighter, but by the basic need of a ranch hand, The horses had to be fed. Charlie Bowdre stepped out into the pre-dawn gloom, mistook a posse member for a horse, and was immediately riddled with the lawman's bullets. He staggered back inside, a dying man, and in a scene of breathtaking dramatic tension, his leader, Billy the Kid, urged him, "Take a few of them with you when you die." Charlie Bowdre, the man who yearned for a life with Manuela, stumbled back outside, too weak to even clear his pistol from its holster, collapsing toward the posse, his final heartbreaking words a repeating, whispered plea. I wish, double quote, did he wish for? The historians argue, but the heart knows. He wished for the simple life he had so nearly grasped. He wished for his wife. He wished he had never left the ranch. His body was sent back to Manuela, a profound final act of respect from the lawman who had killed him, and was laid to rest next to his comrade, Tom O'Folliard. The tragedy is that Charlie Bowdre was not a villain, but a man of weak resolve who, with his heart and feet pointed toward the honest life of a rancher and husband, was murdered by the long shadow of his own regrettable past. His story is the West's cruelest commentary on redemption. Sometimes you simply run out of road, and sometimes the price of friendship is death. I have provided the requested epic retelling within the character limit, focusing on the dramatic irony and thematic contrast between Bowdre's desire for a legal life and his tragic end. Would you like me to now explore the perspective of Manuela Herrera, the wife who waited for the man who never came home? Ah, the tragic echo of Charles Bowdre's life must be further amplified, for his existence was a raw, aching nerve caught between the wild freedom of the desert and the crushing weight of domestic expectation. We must delve deeper into the cruel mechanics of his downfall, where every step toward respectability was met with a brutal, reciprocal tug back into the lawless void. The initial movement away from the outlaw life was a monumental, agonizing effort, a spiritual severance from the intoxicating, yet ultimately toxic, embrace of the regulators and Billy the Kid's charismatic anarchy. The anchor of the earth and the heart, his employment with Thomas Yerby, and crucially, with Pete Maxwell, was more than just a job. It was his declaration of independence from the trail of the fugitive. These were men of means, ranchers whose cattle represented stability, whose land demanded sober commitment, not reckless violence. The act of writing for Maxwell, in particular, placed him geographically and ideologically outside the immediate reach of the gang's mischief. He was seeking to establish a persona, not merely an alibi to transform Charlie Bowdre, the gunman, into Charlie Bowdre, the reliable ranch hand, the neighbor. His ventures into commercial business further cemented this aspiration. Commerce required credit, trust, and a presence in the community, precisely the antithesis of a life lived on the run, hiding in canyons and sleeping with a rifle. This wasn't merely a temporary disguise. It was an investment in a future free of the noose. He was attempting to buy his way back into society, brick by careful brick. Then came the sacred, defining act, his marriage to Manuela Herrera. This was not a casual fling in a saloon, but a binding covenant with a respected local family. Manuela was the sister of Antonia Herrera, the wife of Doc Skurlock, another former regulator who had successfully traded his rifle for a doctor's life and a home. Bowdre was integrating himself into a network of men who had escaped the Kid's thrall. His very choice of bride was a deliberate, loud statement to the territory. I choose peace. I choose a home. I choose this life. The wedding suggested a man whose deepest, most profound inclination was toward a settled existence, a future filled with the murmur of domestic life rather than the crack of gunfire. The ring on his finger was a heavier chain than any manacle, binding him to a future he desperately craved, yet one that his past seemed determined to deny him. The weight of the past, a decision of desperation. The attempt at a legal life, however, always remained contaminated by the stain of the Lincoln County War. Bowdre was complicit in the assassination of Deputy Buckshot Roberts, a murder that hung over him like a perpetual storm cloud. By December 1880, the pressure became unbearable. Sheriff Pat Garrett, a man of relentless focus, was tightening the net. It was at this juncture that Bowdre made the most logical, most courageous, and ultimately, most fatal decision of his entire life. He was ready to give up on Billy the Kid and surrender to face the charges. This decision to surrender was not an act of cowardice, but of immense, calculated bravery born of his commitment to Manuela. A man running forever could never build a home. A man who faced justice, endured the trial, and served his time, could eventually emerge, perhaps scarred, but free to return to his wife and his chosen life. He knew the risks. He knew the power of frontier justice. But the alternative, a life of perpetual flight and fear, was a greater death to the spirit. This move to negotiate terms for the Roberts murder reveals a man attempting to leverage the rule of law to secure his future. A startling transformation from the reckless youth who once rode with the regulators. He was using the very systems he once fought against to buy his own freedom and legitimacy. The fateful detour, the ultimate betrayal of self. But here lies the terrible, agonizing flaw in Charlie Bowdre's character. He lacked the final necessary steel to cut the rope to his past completely. While he was actively seeking terms for surrender, the siren call of loyalty, or perhaps the fear of displeasing Billy the Kid, pulled him back for one final, catastrophic detour. He joined the gang on a mission to ambush Pat Garrett near Fort Sumner. Why? The logic is utterly maddening, a masterstroke of tragic self-sabotage. Perhaps he intended this as a final protective act for the kid, believing if he could help remove the most dangerous threat, the subsequent surrender would be easier for all involved. Perhaps he saw it as an immediate need, a duty to his friends that superseded his long-term plan for his wife. Whatever the reason, this one final foolish expedition sealed his fate. He left the arms of Manuela, who was likely hoping for his return with a signed clemency, only to ride directly into a waiting grave. The night of December 19, 1880, at Fort Sumner, was the beginning of the end, a fierce, sudden tiroteo that shattered the illusion of control. It was here that Deputy Sheriff Bob Ollinger and Pat Garrett began their relentless pursuit. Days later, on December 23rd, the stage for the final act was set at the frozen, forlorn, Stinking Springs Rock House. The intense standoff was the ultimate crucible. The gang, trapped and freezing, were surrounded. The lawmen were patient, cold, and hungry. The fate of Charlie Bowdre, the man who wanted to be a farmer and a husband, was now reduced to a simple existential dread. He made one final fatal decision: to go out and feed the horses. He was thinking of the animals, of the necessity of escape, not of a fight. In the pre-dawn darkness, in a moment of utter confusion, he stepped out and was immediately hit by a fusillade of bullets. The chroniclers report his collapse back into the rock house, covered in his own blood, and the kid's chilling, desperate command to take some of the lawmen with him. But Bowdre, beyond the will to fight, driven only by the instinct of a wounded animal, staggered back outside, falling toward the posse. He wasn't charging. He was retreating to the light, perhaps hoping for aid, perhaps only trying to find an end to the suffering. The words he whispered as he died, I wish, are the most eloquent testament to his cursed existence. He was a man killed not by the law's justice, but by the gravitational pull of his own. Regret unable to escape the final deadly embrace of a past he had fought so desperately to leave behind for the sake of his wife and his home. His tragedy is the story of the West's unforgiving nature. A single mistake, a moment of misplaced loyalty, can erase a lifetime of effort toward redemption. The saga of Charlie Bowdre is a masterpiece of unfulfilled promise, a stark narrative where the scent of gunpowder always overwhelms the scent of the hearth. Would you like me to now focus on the relentless pursuit by Pat Garrett and the tactical elements of the Stinking Springs standoff? The climax of Charlie Bowdre's life and the brutal consummation of his unlucky fate unfolded at a desolate, aptly named locale, Stinking Springs. This was not a grand battlefield of history, but a miserable, frozen, isolated stage for a private tragedy, an arena where the forces of law and the vestiges of the Lincoln County chaos met for their final, deadly reckoning. The events of December 23, 1880, represent the ultimate failure of Bowdre's attempt at redemption, a stark, agonizing moment where all his honest intentions were negated by the loyalty he refused to break. The crucible of Stinking Springs, the final trap, the siege was an inevitable consequence of the gang's foolhardy decision to ambush Pat Garrett. Having narrowly escaped the initial skirmishes at Fort Sumner, Billy the Kid, Charlie Bowdre, Dave Rudabaugh, Tom Pickett, and Billy Wilson found refuge, or so they thought, in a thick-walled rock house at Stinking Springs. This structure, likely used for shelter by shepherds or travelers, suddenly became their final freezing fortress. Sheriff Pat Garrett, driven by a relentless sense of duty and a hefty reward, was not a man to lose the trail. He had gathered a formidable posse of 20 men, all hardened by the territorial feuds, and they surrounded the rock house under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness. The tactical situation was hopeless from the start. The rock house offered protection from bullets but zero mobility. It was a sarcophagus waiting to be sealed. Garrett, understanding the power of patience over bravado, opted for a siege, letting the crushing cold and the slow gnawing of hunger do his work for him. The posse's cordon was complete, a net drawn tight around 5 desperate men. The moral atmosphere inside the rock house was one of cold, desperate denial. The conversation would have been fraught, a mix of the Kid's defiant arrogance and the chilling realization among the others, especially Bowdre, that their end was near. The refusal of the gang to surrender was a group decision, but for Charlie, it was a refusal to seize his last chance at life. Garrett likely offered terms. The gang, trusting neither the word of the law nor their own chances in court, refused. The death of the man who wanted to live. Charlie Bowdre's ultimate moment of self-betrayal occurred shortly before dawn. The siege had been ongoing, and the critical weakness of the position was the lack of food and, most importantly, the unprotected horses. Bowdre, a genuine cowboy who understood the value of horseflesh and the necessity of escape, stepped outside, attempting to tend to the animals or, perhaps, make a run for it. The descriptions of his death are heartbreakingly anticlimactic. He was shot in the chest as he moved past an opening, likely a door or a crude window, in the rock house. It was not a heroic charge, but an act of simple necessity, brutally punished by a hidden sniper. The bullet found the man who wanted to retire, ripping through his lungs and ending his hopes of ever returning to Manuela. He stumbled back inside, bleeding out onto the cold stone floor, and his last, profound words echoed in the small space, a final, clear-eyed acknowledgement of his fate. Fui morto. Billy yells me Mataram. I've been killed, Billy. They've killed me. This statement, directed at his leader, was not accusatory, but perhaps resigned, an epitaph spoken by the man himself. The agonizing final moments are those that truly define the tragedy of Charlie Bowdre. He did not simply collapse. He spent his last reserves of life attempting to perform one final futile act of resistance. He died trying to draw his weapon, a last instinctual move of the gunfighter he had tried so hard not to be, but the strength was gone. And then, the whisper, the repeated, haunting phrase that encapsulates the entire misfortune of his life. Eu queria, eu queria. I wanted to. This was the summation of a life spent regretting, a life defined by a choice between freedom and duty. What did he want? He wanted to survive the moment. He wanted the siege to end. He wanted his wife. He wanted the chance at a trial. He wanted to undo the mistakes that led him back to the rock house. The words are a universal cry of the man whose life ends before his time, his last thought not of vengeance, but of the paths not taken. The long farewell, a body on the ground, the grim aftermath of his death further emphasizes the cold, unrelenting nature of the siege. Bowdre's body, now just a sack of flesh and bone, was used by the remaining gang members as a grisly barricade. Then, in a moment of utter horror, The body was unceremoniously placed outside the rock house near the door, a macabre message to Garrett and a clear sign that the gang was not giving up. His body remained exposed on the ground for the duration of the 2-day siege, a silent, frozen testament to the cost of misplaced loyalty. The ultimate fate of his mortal remains, however, offers a final tiny flicker of the respectability he had sought. After the siege ended with the capture of the remaining outlaws, Pat Garrett showed a rare moment of deference to the legitimate life Bowdre had tried to live. Bowdre's body was not discarded on the prairie. It was returned to his wife, Manuela Herrera. This was an act of recognition. Garrett, perhaps, understood that the man he killed was a man trying to change. Charlie Bowdre was finally buried beside Tom O'Folliard, another member of Billy the Kid's gang, who had been killed by Garrett just days earlier. They lie in a shared grave, two young men whose lives were violently truncated by the chaotic forces of the New Mexico Territory. His tombstone marks him as a fallen outlaw, but the soil that covers him contains the remains of a man who died wanting to be something more: a husband, a rancher, a free man. The story of Stinking Springs and the death of Charlie Bowdre is the perfect, tragic encapsulation of the Old West's brutal thesis. You can try to leave the game, but the game rarely lets you go. The life he built with Manuela, the employment, the surrender attempts, all were rendered meaningless by a single bullet, proving that for some, the shadow of the past is more concrete and deadly than any promise of the future. The epic of Bowdre ends not with a bang, but with a whisper of regret. I wanted to. Would you like me to now explore the immediate and long-term consequences of the Stinking Springs capture on Billy the Kid and the end of the regulator era? The final chords of Charlie Bowdre's mournful ballad resonate not with the triumphant blare of a heroic saga, but with the quiet, persistent strumming of fate's relentless disappointment. His life cut short in the frozen dirt of Stinking Springs serves as a profound historical footnote, a study in what happens when a man's legitimate aspirations collide fatally with the unbreakable chains of loyalty and a violently tenacious past. The ill-fated destiny, an outlaw cursed by good intentions, Bowdre is a figure of immense pathos, defined by the sheer volume of his failed attempts at a clean life. His commitment to Manuela Herrera, his honest labor for Maxwell and Yerby, and his express decision to surrender, all were logical, decisive movements toward a peaceful existence. Yet, each step toward the sun was matched by an unseen, deadly undertow pulling him back into the shadows of the Kid's orbit. This is the essence of O Azar du Destino, the Azar of fate, that crowns Bowdre as one of the Old West's most unlucky outlaws. His misfortune was not a lack of courage. He was a seasoned gunman who fought bravely in the Lincoln County War. His misfortune was a lack of resolve to completely betray his friends, a final, fatal deference to the volatile charisma of Billy the Kid. He chose friendship over future, loyalty over life, and that choice became the trajectory of the bullet that killed him. He possessed the courage to face a jury, but lacked the courage to abandon his brothers in arms. This internal conflict is what makes him so much more compelling than a mere footnote. He was a good man trapped in a bad life, dying for a cause he was actively trying to leave. His ultimate failure confirms the Old West's cruelest lesson. Innocence is hard to recover once lost, and the price of redemption can be your life. Historical memory. A shadow in the legend. Charlie Bowdre's legacy endures, not in monuments or great tales of individual glory, but as in part integrant de infame lenda de Billy the Kid. He is the constant companion, the loyal lieutenant whose fate underscores the grim trajectory of the entire gang. His death was a pivotal moment in the narrative of the hunt, the first successful kill of the siege, the event that demoralized the remaining outlaws, and the clear signal that Garrett was not playing games. His story adds necessary depth to the often simplistic narrative of the Indomaval Historia du Velho Oeste. It reminds us that not all gunmen were irredeemable psychopaths. Many were young men caught in the grinding gears of historical conflict, desperate to escape. Bowdre represents the ranch hand who picked up a gun, fought a war he couldn't win, and then desperately tried to put the gun down only to be killed by the residual violence of his choices. He is the quiet tragedy in the background of the great spectacle, and for those who seek the nuance of history, his sacrifice for a failed loyalty speaks volumes more than the kid's prolonged defiance. His body, resting next to unfulfilled, is a final physical statement on the cost of the frontier life. He is remembered, therefore, as a symbol of frustrated loyalty and unfulfilled domesticity, his ghost lingering in the New Mexico wind, whispering the words, "I wanted to, I wanted to." The legend of Billy the Kid would be incomplete and less tragic without the story of the friend who died trying to escape him. Appello final. A palavra final sobre tragedia de Charlie Bowdre, and there you have it. The epic, heart-wrenching chronicle of Charlie Bowdre, the man who nearly traded his outlaw spurs for a wedding band, only to be dragged back by the deadly embrace of friendship. His is a story that reveals the raw, human cost of the Old West, where the simplest dreams, a home, a wife, a clean slate, were the hardest ones to achieve. If this deep dive into the tragic irony of Bowdre's life resonated with you, if you felt the chill of the stinking spring siege and the weight of his final regret, then we ask for your support. Don't let Charlie Bowdre's memory fade into the cold desert wind. Click some like Nest video right now to honor the memory of the outlaw who just wanted a quiet life. Inscríbase and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next historical deep dive. We have many more untold stories from the American frontier waiting to be revealed. Comente abaixo. What was Charlie Bowdre's biggest mistake? Was it joining the ambush, or was it never leaving Billy the Kid in the first place? Let us know your perspective. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most poignant, unlucky tales of the Wild West.